Edward Blake was a successful businessman. By the age of 30, he had transformed the company his late father had left behind into one of the fastest-growing firms in the country. He lived in an elegant neighborhood in London with his mother, Margaret Blake, whose greatest wish was to see her son happily married. Edward was engaged to Charlotte Evans. Charlotte was stunningly beautiful but extremely proud and self-centered. Her father, Richard Evans, was a powerful industrialist, and she had grown up surrounded by wealth and luxury. Designer fashion, expensive sports cars, and glamorous parties were all part of her everyday life. Her engagement to Edward was less about love and more about the business alliance it created between their influential families. Whenever Charlotte met Edward, she always wanted things her own way. "You'll have to buy a house that suits my standards, Edward. This old neighborhood simply isn't for me," she would say. Edward would quietly listen and smile. Deep down, he knew Charlotte cared more about his wealth and social status than about him. But because of family expectations, he remained silent. Edward's executive secretary was Emily Carter, a kind, intelligent, and hardworking young woman. She came from a middle-class family and had become the sole support for her household after her father's passing. Emily held a master's degree and was exceptionally dedicated to her work. She often stayed late at the office preparing reports, organizing important meetings, and even helping Edward manage confidential files. One day, before an important board meeting, Edward looked completely exhausted. Emily made him a cup of coffee and said with a warm smile, "Sir, why don't you take a short break? I'll handle the presentation." For the first time, Edward truly looked into her eyes. There was no greed or ambition in them, only sincerity and kindness. From that moment on, his heart slowly began to lean toward Emily. As the weeks passed, Edward found himself spending more and more time with her. Tired of Charlotte's endless demands and arrogance, he found peace in the office, where Emily patiently listened to him and helped him through his worries. One evening, while they were working late, Edward looked at her and said, "Emily, you're so different. Charlotte is always asking for something, but you've never expected anything from me." Emily blushed softly and smiled without saying a word. Little by little, their feelings grew stronger. Edward promoted Emily to become his personal assistant, and they started spending even more time together. Eventually, he confessed that his engagement to Charlotte was only the result of family pressure and not something his heart truly wanted. At first, Emily tried to stop him. "Sir, this isn't right. You're already engaged." But Edward's loneliness and his honest emotions slowly broke down the walls she had built around herself. One rainy evening, after leaving the office, their car broke down on the side of the road. As they waited for help, they talked openly about their lives. Emily shared the struggles she had faced after losing her father. Gathering his courage, Edward finally spoke the words he had been hiding. "Emily, I'm in love with you. My relationship with Charlotte is nothing more than an obligation." Tears filled Emily's eyes. "I care about you too, more than I should. But people will never accept us." From that day on, a secret relationship began between them. Edward filled Emily's life with little moments of happiness, quiet dinners, thoughtful gifts, and genuine care. For the first time in years, Emily felt that life had given her something beautiful. But neither of them realized that this happiness would soon become the greatest tragedy of their lives. Meanwhile, Charlotte noticed that Edward had changed. He returned home late, answered fewer of her calls, and seemed distant. One day, she accidentally saw a message from Emily on Edward's phone. "Will we meet tonight?" A wave of jealousy and anger swept over her. But instead of confronting Edward, she chose to stay silent and plan her revenge. Edward and Emily's love continued to grow. Edward even tried to postpone the wedding, but both families pressured him to continue with the engagement. Charlotte pretended to be heartbroken and acted as though she could not live without him. One evening, Edward promised Emily, "I'll end this engagement, and one day I'll marry you." Emily wanted to believe him, but she was afraid of what the future might bring. Charlotte secretly hired a private investigator. Soon, she received photographs and videos of every meeting between Edward and Emily. Her anger turned into hatred. "That ordinary girl thinks she can take Edward away from me," she whispered to herself. She spent the entire night planning her revenge. Charlotte told her father everything. Richard Evans calmly replied, "Don't worry, my dear. We'll teach them a lesson they will never forget." The plan began quietly. First, False complaints were filed against Emily at the company. Then rumors about her character were spread among relatives and neighbors. But this was only the beginning. Edward eventually met Charlotte and told her that he wanted to end their engagement. Charlotte cried and begged him to stay, but behind her tears, she had already made up her mind. Using her family's influence, she secretly manipulated confidential company documents and arranged for evidence that would falsely point to Emily. Soon, a massive scandal exploded inside Edward's company. Emily was accused of financial corruption. Investigators arrived, and she was taken away for questioning. Edward was horrified. He knew Emily was innocent, but the fabricated evidence was convincing enough to make everyone doubt her. Emily's mother cried helplessly while Edward hired the best lawyers he could find. However, Richard Evans' political and business connections made the legal battle almost impossible. One day, Charlotte visited Edward and gave him an offer. "If you agree to marry me, I'll make everything disappear." Edward looked directly into her eyes and replied, "I would rather lose everything than betray the woman I love." Charlotte's anger grew even darker. She launched another cruel attack. Edited photographs and fake videos were anonymously spread across social media, destroying Emily's reputation. People who once respected her now turned away. Friends abandoned her, neighbors whispered about her, and even her younger brother, unable to bear the humiliation, left home. When Emily was finally released, she discovered that society had already judged her. Everywhere she went, people stared at her with suspicion. Edward brought her into his own home to keep her safe, but Charlotte was far from finished. She persuaded several of Edward's business partners to withdraw from major contracts. Within weeks, his company began to collapse, and he suffered devastating financial losses. Still, Charlotte could not let go of her hatred. She confronted Margaret Blake and told her everything, threatening that if Edward did not leave Emily, she would ruin both families forever. Margaret, frightened by the growing scandal, begged her son to end the relationship. Edward found himself trapped between love and family. Then tragedy struck. One dark evening, Emily was attacked by a group of unknown criminals while walking home. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. When Edward arrived, he was devastated to see her lying unconscious. Doctors warned him that her chances of survival were very small. Furious and heartbroken, Edward called Charlotte. "You've destroyed enough lives. Was this all you're doing?" On the other end of the line, Charlotte simply laughed. "You betrayed me, Edward. Now you have to live with the consequences." As if that were not enough, false allegations of tax fraud and financial misconduct were brought against Edward's company. An official investigation began, and Edward was arrested. While he was fighting to prove his innocence, Emily's condition grew worse. In her final moments, she opened her eyes and weakly smiled at Edward. "Promise me, you'll find a way to be happy." A short time later, Emily passed away peacefully. For Edward, it felt as though his entire world had ended. Months later, he was finally released after the truth behind the financial accusations slowly began to unravel. But by then, everything he had built was gone. His company had collapsed, his family home had been sold, and his mother had become seriously ill from stress and heartbreak. Charlotte eventually became engaged to someone else, but fate was not kind to her either. Her father's business empire suffered heavy losses as scandals and lawsuits surrounded the family. Friends disappeared, and the glamorous life she once adored slowly fell apart. For the first time, Charlotte realized what her jealousy and obsession had cost. She had not only destroyed Emily and Edward's lives, she had destroyed her own. Unable to escape the guilt, she became isolated and emotionally broken. She would often whisper Edward's name and beg for forgiveness, but there was no one left to hear her. Edward left London behind and moved to a quiet little town in the countryside. He lived a simple life, carrying with him the memories of the woman who had loved him without greed or conditions. Every night, he would sit alone by the window, looking at the stars and remembering Emily's smile. The greatest pain of his life was knowing that the woman he loved had suffered because of him. In the end, the story became a painful reminder that jealousy, pride, and hatred can destroy everything they touch. Love without honesty and respect can lead not to happiness, but to heartbreak and ruin. And sometimes, by the time people realize the value of sincerity and kindness, it is already too late.